Ok? Bom, queria agradecer o professor Jean Tible pela abertura para a inclusão do seminário do Jeffrey Weber no programa de seminários da pós-graduação aqui do Departamento de Ciência Política. O Jeffrey está no Brasil por motivo de pesquisa, está realizando uma pesquisa sobre os movimentos sociais, as esquerdas brasileiras. E essa semana ele estará em São Paulo, amanhã na Unicamp, né? E na semana que vem no Rio de Janeiro. E agradecer ao professor Weber pelo aceite, né? Em realizar um seminário sobre o seu trabalho. O professor Jeffrey é professor de política da Escola de Políticas e Relações Internacionais da Universidade de Londres. É autor do livro Red October e do livro From Rebellion to Reform in Bolivia. É também coautor do livro Blood of Extraction, Canadian Imperialism in Latin America, com Todd Gordon. E aqui, nesse seminário, ele vai falar sobre um livro publicado em 2017, que dá nome a esse seminário, The Last Day of Oppression, The First Day of the Same, uma pesquisa sobre política e economia na nova esquerda latino-americana. Eu vou, então, passar a palavra ao professor Weber, que falará por 40 minutos, e, em seguida, a gente abre as perguntas, a discussão. A conferência, o seminário será feito em inglês, mas depois, se for o caso, quem não se sentir à vontade para fazer a pergunta em inglês, pode fazer em português, eu traduzo na sequência. É isso, muito obrigada.
Okay, thanks very much, Daniela, for the invitation to speak today, and thanks for everyone for being here tonight. As Daniela mentioned, I'm going to talk mostly about this latest book, The Last Day of Oppression and the First Day of the Same, but it will also link up to a book that I just finished, which hasn't yet been published, with Massimo Modenesi from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and Frank Gurichot from the University of Grenoble. So I'll be linking these themes, but I want to start by talking about the rather enigmatic title of The Last Day of Oppression and the First Day of the Same. This slogan comes from the early Republican period in Ecuador, immediately following independence from Spain, in which more radical Republican forces started to understand that independence had not meant a social revolution. It had meant a political revolution, political independence from Spain, but it hadn't brought with it an upturning of the social order. And therefore, for those on the lower orders of society, much of daily life looked very similar to the late colonial period under Spain. And the slogan, therefore, came up as graffiti on the capital of Quito, saying the last day of oppression and the first day of the same. Now, under Rafael Correa in the 21st century, the indigenous movement, and in particular Luis Macas, in an interview I conducted with him in 2010, reinvented this slogan to characterize the initial hope that movements had had in the election of Rafael Correa, and then the dismay of the continuities under Correa, and the failure to represent a genuine rupture with what came before. This, again, the last day of oppression and the first day of the same. This also resonated, I think, more widely than the Ecuadorian context, insofar as parts of the left looking internationally, parts of the left looking at Latin America in the early part of this century as one of the singular regions of hope in the world, as a area of resistance to neoliberalism. Many of them spoke of Latin America experiencing a sort of second independence in a certain way, and what they meant by that was a positive reference, an independence from a relative autonomy from U.S. domination, and a relative autonomy from, or a break with, orthodox neoliberalism. Now, obviously, by choosing this, this title for my book, I have a more pessimistic version of this idea, of the limits of what the left, in terms of the governments that came to office, the progressive governments, what we ought to have expected from them, and what they ended up delivering was more continuity than rupture. So that will be one of the main theses of today. Not simply that statement, but to explain that process. So what's the book about? It effectively tries to chart the economics and politics of the Latin American left from roughly 1990 until the present. And it conceives of the left in a very broad sense in all of its social movement, party, and regime modalities. So I'm not interested only in thinking of the left in terms of once parties have achieved office and then looking at their policy ins and outs, which has been, I think, too much of the focus of much of the commentary on left-wing governments, but to think of a much more expansive sense of social lefts, of social power, in addition to formal political articulation in the electoral arena and formal institutional settings and so on. And within that context, I tried to trace the shifting balance of forces from 1990 until the present between three basic clusters of power. On the one hand, the oppressed and exploited classes and groups at the lower end of societies, how capable are they of independently organizing sociologically, ideologically, politically, sometimes militarily over these periods, relative to two other clusters of power. The dominant domestic ruling classes in all of their internal complexity, how capable are they at different moments since 1990 to cohere in singular projects around effective ends from their perspective. And finally, the influence of external powers, mainly, clearly, the United States, but not exclusively the United States. And to think about all these three clusters of power as shifting and dynamic in relationship to one another, rather than as static entities of unmoving variables. So what I want to do today in the time that I have is to split the talk into two basic components. The first is to very briefly go through some of the theoretical interventions that the book makes, and then in the second half of the talk to try to present in a cursory way a periodization of the left from the 1990s until the present, moving through four different phases. And so clearly I'm going to do a lot of structural violence to the heterogeneity of Latin America by speaking in region-wide terms without a lot of specificity in this or that country, but maybe in the Q&A we can talk about how this relates to specific cases. But I'm going to make a lot of general statements, some of which are indefensible when you look at particular cases, but I think I'm capturing something of the regional dynamic. So to begin with the theoretical components, there's four debates that I intervene in. The first one is more of a axiomatic premise with which I start in terms of conceptualizing state formation and state forms in Latin America. And that's to think of them necessarily as doubly determined. In the first instance, by the historical subordinate incorporation of different Latin American states into the world market. So that is different Latin American states' position inside of the International Division of Labor, which determines production, distribution, consumption of specific goods and services in specific zones and regions for the world market at different periods. This has a tremendous consequence for the structural formation of states in the region. And this in dialectical relationship with a second component, which is this shifting balance of forces between the principal antagonistic social classes and their ability to configure institutional arrangements at different historical moments based on their power or lack thereof vis-a-vis one another. These two components, if you want, international and domestic, dialectically determine state forms over time. So basic axiomatic premise of the book is to shift between these different levels of analysis. The second theoretical intervention is related to more contemporary debates around inequality in the region, including the international commentary on Latin America, because Latin America became somewhat of a paradoxical region of the world in the early 21st century, insofar as it remained the most unequal part of the world, not the poorest, but the most unequal by any measure. And yet it seemed to be, at least in some measures, Gini coefficient and so on, the only part of the world that seemed to be moving in an opposite trajectory to increasing inequality towards a relative reduction of inequality. And this was true even of states which were governed by right-wing governments. So this wasn't a particularity of left-wing governments, although left-wing governments did achieve some marginal improvements beyond right-wing governments. So this wasn't just a structural issue. This also had dynamics of politics. But the question of inequality tends to be dominated still in the literature on Latin American equality by two very inadequate theoretical traditions. The first is a Weberian historical sociological understanding of inequality with a deeply impoverished conception of social class, one which thinks of social class in static terms and in terms of status and income, rather than in terms of processes of structural exploitation and class conflict. So these last two variables, exploitation and conflict in a relational dynamic sense, are unexplored and unexplained by Weberian historical sociology. And I'm arguing that Weberian historical sociology informs much of the discussion of inequality, even when people don't understand themselves in those terms. Okay? It is implicitly informing much of the conception of class. The other dominant characteristic and inadequacy of much discussion of inequality in Latin America has been the implicit or explicit commitment to variations of liberal democratic theory, which pose democracy in a highly truncated, circumscribed conceptualization, which takes as an axiomatic premise, again, either explicit or implicit, that capitalist markets, even if properly regulated, capitalist markets are in the end positive for they are in net outcomes positive for democracy, so conceived in this narrow sense. And therefore, liberal democratic theory is literally incapable of understanding capitalist markets as spheres of coercion, in which there might be movements to escape the logic of the capitalist market, not to find liberty within it. And so this demanded a very different kind of theorization of inequality. And I begin with the premise of reintroducing a Marxist conception of totality, of capitalist totality, in which you think about the distinct moments that constitute capitalist totality in very specific ways. So the way I do that is to try to reintroduce E.P. Thompson's notion of social class in conversation with this Weberian historical sociology, and particularly the Thompsonian commitment to thinking of class as relational, historical, and processual, rather than as static and income-based conceptions of class. But Thompson was, of course, limited by the historical period he was in. He has no theorization of gender inequality, he has no theorization of race, and therefore he can't understand capitalist totality in its whole. So we can learn a lot from Thompson, but we have to be more Thompsonian than Thompson himself in terms of historicizing, for example, spheres of social reproduction and the relationship of race in the formation of class. So the way I think about this is 5 distinct moments of capitalist totality, beginning with the sphere of production in the workplace, moving to the sphere of exchange or the labor market, then thinking through social reproduction, the reproduction of labor mainly by unpaid women's labor, but also by paid women's labor in reproductive spheres that have been partially taken over by the state or by commodity production, such as education, gendered forms of work in education, gendered forms of work in healthcare, and so on. Those are the first 3 moments. The fourth moment is race and racism, the way that race and racism divides, creates divisions within the laboring classes, and provides an ideological cover for unequal economic rewards inside of these class dynamics. And finally, fundamental to thinking about the extractive phase of capitalism that Latin America is once again very much inside of, is the relationship between capitalism and nature, or capitalism and non-human nature. So in particular, the way in which capitalism relates to its substratum of nature, both in terms of commodifying it as an input into production and as commodifying nature as a dumping ground for waste. So these 5 moments run through the book in different ways. The third component is an attempt to revive a certain conceptualization of the romantic tradition within Marxism. So this is against a revitalization of Marxism based on a linear, economistic, stagist, productivist notion of development. And here the polemic is really against Álvaro García Linera, the vice president of Bolivia, and one of the preeminent Marxist theorists of contemporary Latin American social theory. The argument is that he reproduces a certain form of linear productivist conceptions of development, which in the Bolivian case, but more widely, became associated with various state ideologies of the Andean left in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and Bolivia, in which particular alliances with multinational capital in natural gas and oil extraction, mining mineral extraction, agro-industrial commodity production, and so on, was seen as necessary in a linear conception of properly developing industrial capitalism through specific phases before a promised communist society 50 to 100 years in the future. Okay, so you needed to properly develop capitalism in order to arrive at the promised land in the very distant future. This has a very long history of traditions within Marxism, obviously, but there is also a romantic tradition which has always spoken against this. And I think in the West, with all of their internal varieties, you can see this in Lukács, you can see this in Gramsci, you can see this in Luxemburg, you can see this in Benjamin and in E.P. Thompson. But in the Latin American context, what I'm trying to revive in particular is José Carlos Mariátegui's notion of a utopian revolutionary dialectic which selectively borrows from the pre-capitalist past, not in some kind of simplistic, nostalgic notion of return, but selectively borrowing from the pre-capitalist past in combination with a forward-looking post-capitalist vision. So what that meant in particular in the 1920s from Mariátegui and in the 1930s was the recovery of the notion that the indigenous ayllus or communitarian structures of, at the time, still somewhat autonomous from capitalist development in Peru, in the Andes, to see them as embodying certain traditions of communal, non-capitalist social relations, which could be continued and contribute to a post-capitalist future. But this would be necessarily in combination with working-class strategic action in the heartland of Peruvian capitalism. Okay? But the notion was, rather than seeing, as the Comintern did at the time, that you needed to run over indigenous ayllus in order to create industrial capitalist development, which would lay the bases for communism, the ayllus themselves represented the possibility of a certain agrarian form of that post-capitalist future. Okay? But that it couldn't survive on its own. It needed an alliance with working-class capitalism. Now, obviously, we're not in the 1920s, and you can't just project Mariátegui into the present. But what I'm saying is that Mariátegui introduces a very different perspective of Marxism into the context of the extractive capitalism debates by suggesting that perhaps an alliance with multinational capital in order to intensify these extractive activities isn't the way forward for Marxism, but rather the way forward for industrial capitalist development of a very traditional kind. So this is another element which I also relate in specific ways with Mariátegui to the late Marx. Although Mariátegui was not aware of the late Marx, when you think about Marx's writings of the peasant communes in Russia, you see very deep affinities with Mariátegui's conception of the ayllus in the present. And if we don't want to discredit the notion of Marxism today, I think in this very difficult context that Latin America finds itself in, I think wedding ourselves to these romantic traditions is a much more fruitful entry than wedding ourselves to the project of García Linera and his adherents. The last theoretical tradition that I intervene in is the new season of Gramscian studies inside of Latin America, and in particular the debates around the conception of passive revolution as a way of understanding this left turn. And in particular, the different moments in the dialectic between transformation and restoration in Gramsci's conception of passive revolution, and the ability only with hindsight to look back on an epoch and characterize the general epoch with different moments of transformation and restoration to give a characterization of the general epoch as primarily restorative or primarily transformative. And what I want to suggest is that this passive revolution that South America in particular has gone through in all of its different national state varieties has been one of fundamental restorative relations of domination rather than transformative relations in the end. The other thing that I add to that discussion of Gramsci, however, is that in many, even of the most sophisticated discussions of passive revolutions, there tends to be a highly politicist reading of Gramsci, in which the dialectical unity of the political and economic, that is, the relationship between politics and rhythms of capitalist accumulation, are somewhat disembedded. So we have this autonomy of politics in which we think about processes of bureaucratization and transformism without thinking about the material reproduction of the forms of capitalism that have taken hold in South America in the current period. So in my intervention into these debates, I tried to restore a balance, say, between the economic and the political, which was present in Gramsci, but which seems to have been evacuated in some of the discussions of Gramsci in the contemporary period. So those, in very superficial form, are the four theoretical currents running through the book. Probably of more interest to everyone are the periodization and characterization of the different empirical phases of the left, which I'll try to do in the remaining time. So the way I think through this is to divide the period from 1990 until the present into four distinct but overlapping phases. Between 1990 and 2000, a period of relatively uncontested neoliberal advance in which, in terms of those clusters of power, imperialism was at its height, having the Cold War gone in favor of the United States, a hyper exaggerated sense of triumphalism of global capitalism during this period, very deep penetration of international financial institutions and foreign capital in Latin America during this period, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund with tremendous leverage over domestic economic policy making, and so on. A period of relative neoliberal hegemony between 1990 and towards the end of the 1990s, 2000. Then, overlapping with this period, 1998 to 2002, is the period in which this neoliberal hegemony enters into crisis, first in a deep economic recession between 1998 and 2002, which then, in different ways, bleeds into an organic crisis of neoliberal states throughout South America. Over this period as well, then, of neoliberal crisis, you have a period of rearticulation of an extra-parliamentary left, different varieties of social movements, which I'll get into. And then you enter the third period, 2003 to 2011, which is characterized by a commodities boom, a return of capitalist dynamism, a shift from extra-parliamentary left politics to electoral left politics, the rise of center-left and left governments to office, and the establishment of what Eduardo Godinez calls compensatory states. And then finally, the period between 2012 and the present, which I think is overdetermined by the delayed reverberation of the global economic crisis of 2008, which reaches Latin American shores, and particular South American shores, in a delayed way by 2012. And I'll talk about the mechanisms in which that happens. And this undercuts the material reproductive capacities of compensatory states, undercuts the reproductive capacities of left projects, left governments come into crisis, and the rise of new rights start to emerge throughout that period. So, beginning with that first phase, 1990 to 2000, I think it's important to start there because in 1990, by any metric, I think, the Latin American left was at its lowest point in modern history. It would have been very difficult to imagine at that point that only a decade later, Latin America would once again be one of the leading edges of anti-neoliberal resistance in the world. There were people who proclaimed this, but they were the people who are perennially optimistic about the revolutionary moment, always predicting this. There were no bases to believe this. You had a the residue of the, on the one hand, the physical violence of the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes of the Southern Cone in the preceding period, which literally wiped out a layer of leading cadre of left organizations, and the ability of those left cadre to use the regular transmission belts of reproducing left culture, left organizational practices, were physically wiped out by the violence of military regimes. In Central America, you had the counterinsurgents forces of the 70s and 80s, which did the same basic mechanism on a much wider scale of physically annihilating the capacities, the infrastructures of the left. So it's no surprise in that very basic way that even after the formal end of those dictatorships, the formal end of those civil wars and counterinsurgent processes, that there was no easy reproductive capacities of the left to instantly come out of those situations. But on top of this, there had been an economic transformation of deep and profound proportions, beginning with the early 80s debt crisis, which fundamentally transformed the class structures of most Latin American societies. In the rural areas, you have an accelerated process of urbanization as trade liberalization in agricultural markets undercuts small peasant production, leading to massive depeasantization, proletarianization of huge swaths of the peasantry, who join urban labor markets not through the attraction of the jobs in the cities, where there are in fact no jobs waiting for them, but entering into a surplus reserve army of labor in the informal markets. And at the same time, in the urban class structure, you have, through the privatization of state-owned enterprises and so on in all kinds of strategic sectors, the massive cutting of jobs through austerity measures of state-owned enterprises, which also facilitates the informalization of the world of work. So the basic foundational power of traditional union structures, peasant associations, was economically undercut by these dynamics. Ideologically, you had the end of the Cold War, the isolation of the Cuban Revolution, the defeat of the Nicaraguan Revolution. There was no sense anywhere in Latin America that anything like a socialist future was a possibility in people's lifetimes, whereas this was understood as commonsensical in the 1960s and 1970s on the left in Latin America. So this ideological transformation meant that center-left and left parties drifted massively to the right, accepting basically the parameters of neoliberal economics, with the debate effectively being at what pace and to what extent do we carry out structural adjustment programs, rather than some kind of definitive combat with these areas. So the left did not look in a good position, no matter how you look at this in the 1990s. There were, of course, defensive exceptions, which some people point to theoretically in their periodizations as the beginning of this left turn, which I think is a mistake. But you can think about the 1989 Caracazo in Venezuela. Some people point this to the beginning of the Bolivarian process. For different reasons, I think this is wrong. But this was a defensive, explosive struggle, which is very important, but it had very minimal residual capacity or infrastructural lasting capacity on the Venezuelan left. People also point to the Zapatistas of 1994. But the Zapatistas, I think, are characteristic of a defensive struggle, isolated to a single state in the south of Mexico, and theorizing the absence of a project of state power precisely because this was in no way imaginable in this context. The idea that the Zapatistas were in a position to theoretically achieve state power in Mexico. You can think about the 1990 massive insurrections of indigenous people in Ecuador, which I think was perhaps the only offensive movement of that period. But in general, so there are exceptions, but in general, the wave is to the right, and the wave is to the disarticulation of social movements and a total transformation of urban and rural class structures. This meant that when neoliberalism enters into a very deep economic crisis, particularly centered in South America, so between 98 and 2002, you had the deepest four-year recession since anything like the early 1980s. And this very deep recession, importantly, on a political level, occurs at a time when self-described conservative or liberal parties in favor of neoliberalism are in power virtually everywhere in South America. So they own these crises in a very particular way, politically. And their solution, their proposed solution to the crisis, is the promise of a deeper, more accelerated neoliberalism. The problem was that we didn't go far enough. We need to go further in cutting the bureaucratic red tape that persisted and so on. Now, whereas this had had some ideological appeal in the early 1980s in a context of hyperinflation and in a context in which Latin Americans hadn't yet experienced the neoliberal laboratory of Pinochet's economics and so on, after 2 decades of having already experienced this and having experienced the social consequences of this with very, very low rates of growth, with higher levels of inequality, poverty by any indication, depeasantization, the informalization of the world of work, and so on. After that, you enter into a very deep recession, and the promise of governments in power is simply more of the same. This had no ideological appeal, which of course did not mean that there was a left alternative to this moment. But you start to see, in the first instance, an answer by the social left, the extra-parliamentary left, before you see it in a formal political sense of political parties. So you see the unemployed workers movement in Argentina. You see the urban and rural left indigenous insurrections, beginning with the Cochabamba water war, moving through the gas wars in Bolivia. You see in Ecuador the rearticulation of an indigenous movement there. In all 3 of these countries, capable of extraordinary disruptive power, bringing down series of governments, even without a possibility of a political project to fill the vacuum of the power vacuum which their own social mobilization was creating through their disruption and decomposition of neoliberal governments. So neoliberal governments and party systems everywhere in South America, to a lesser extent in parts of Central America, with Mexico largely unaffected by this dynamic, you start to see the decomposition of these neoliberal party systems, their political capabilities of reproducing their project, even without left-wing parties to replace them in elections. If you move into the third period now between 2003 and 2011, you see quite a dramatic change on the economic and political fronts simultaneously. Economically, you see not a recession, but the return of capitalist dynamism in Latin America, in most of Latin America, beginning in 2003, driven by dynamics of accumulation elsewhere in the world market, the most dynamic zone of accumulation being China and its industrialization, driving up commodity prices of basic mining mineral prices, natural gas and oil prices, agro-industrial commodity prices, and so on. This has a tremendous dynamizing effect on economies in South America in particular, and that economic shift to capitalist dynamism happens in a coincidental fashion with the rise of center-left and left governments in country after country, and I presume I don't need to list them in this audience, throughout South America. And what this allowed center-left and left governments to do, this new capitalist dynamism based in the extractive sectors, was to introduce relatively modest royalty and tax increases in those extractive sectors, to redirect those through various distributive programs, often using already existing cash transfer programs from the neoliberal period, but building them up with more capital running through them, rent collected from the extractive sectors, and to generate jobs through ricochet effects of employment from the extractive sector, fanning out into other sectors of the economy. Often very poor jobs, insecure jobs, but nonetheless employment, which was lifting up poverty rates throughout South America. So a genuine uplift in livelihoods in most South American economies, as you would expect in a period of capitalist dynamism. And I mean, indeed, it would have been an achievement not to have reduced poverty in an extraordinary period of capitalist boom. But what this allowed left governments to do is to delay a certain class question. By that I mean, even as they were able to uplift the basic living standards of their primary social bases in the lower classes, they were able to do so at the same time as guaranteeing net profitability for multinational capital at higher rates than they had achieved in the mid-1990s. This is one of the main reasons why none of the fundamental multinational investors in Bolivia's natural gas industry, for example, leave during this period. They all maintain their presence, and the reason is straightforward, that they were enjoying net profitability at a higher rate than they had been in the 90s. This doesn't mean, of course, that international capital was happy with these new left governments. At the beginning, they attempted to destabilize them in various ways. But once they learned that net profitability was guaranteed during this period, they were more or less willing to enter into collaborative relationships of different kinds. This is what Eduardo Guidinas means fundamentally by a compensatory state. A state that doesn't transform social property relations, doesn't transform fundamental class structures of society, but achieves a certain class compromise between capital and the lower orders, but one that is fundamentally contingent on the continuity of a positive external environment in the world market. Now, when the global crisis hits capitalism, of course, the worst one since the 1930s, in 2007, 2008, beginning in the subprime mortgage market of the United States, and then bleeding firstly into the Eurozone, many commentators, particularly those on the Keynesian left looking at South America, Argentina, Brazil, and so on as models, were suggesting that there was a way of these left governments regulating capitalist states to regulate their way out of this crisis. That is to say, to not be affected in fundamental ways by the crisis through countercyclical spending and so on. And although many of us saw this position as naive from the beginning, there was a plausibility to it for the first few years, because South America in particular, after a brief dip in 2009, restores growth in 2010, 2011 on an aggregate scale. It seems to be outside of the rhythms of the general collapse of the centers of the world economy. This was not true of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, which immediately entered into crisis because of their much deeper imbrication in the U.S. market. So immediately, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean went into crisis because they lost their principal export market, they lost their principal source of foreign exchange in remittances from documented and undocumented labor. But in South America, because of the shift to East Asian growth, so long as Chinese dynamism was continuing, you had the possibility of restored commodity prices, which was really driving the fundamental dynamic of South American capitalism in that period. The problem comes when China begins to slow down in 2011, and every year at a slower rate since, even though China continues to be the fastest growing zone of accumulation in the world market, at a lower rate every year of accumulation. There's no real restoration of growth in the Eurozone. There's no real recovery in the United States to make up for the reduction of industrialization in China. And this means that mineral prices start to fall beginning in 2011. There's a dramatic fall in natural gas and oil prices in mid-2014. And the class question that the early period of capitalist dynamism that compensatory states, progressive governments were able to avoid suddenly comes radically to the foreground, which is to say it's a class question about who was going to pay for this new situation of austerity, this new situation in which you had no easy rents to extract through commodities, through royalties and taxation in the commodity sectors. So it was either going to be shifting that cost onto capital through more aggressive confrontations of different ways, modest taxations, all the way to various forms of expropriation, or it was going to be shifting that social cost onto the traditional social bases of the left through a reduction of spending, introductions of various forms of austerity, and so on. And in country after country, what you saw center-left and left governments do in different ways was make the class decision that their principal social bases in the lower classes were more or less guaranteed. You could reduce their benefits from these processes, and the primary focus was on presenting credibility to capital, continuing credibility to capital. Now, this wager, and we can look at different cases the way this played out, but this wager fundamentally failed almost everywhere. The reason why it did is that their traditional social bases started to become unavailable for mobilization, defense of these governments against a resurgent optimistic new right. And at the same time, capital had never seen in these governments a natural home, a natural affiliation. They had learned to live with them, but only insofar as profitability was guaranteed, high rates of accumulation, and so on. As these processes entered into crisis, there was no reason for capital to continue to adhere to them when possibilities started opening up to their more natural bases, either in newly configured right wings or traditional rights that were garnered with new life. And it wasn't just, therefore, new rights taking the opportunity to seize upon the moment of capitalist downturn. It was also the fact that progressive governments systematically moved themselves to the right, shifting the entire terrain of contestation into a terrain much more favorable both to electoral victories of the right, and we can run through them. They really begin with Macri in Argentina, but congressional elections in Venezuela the same year. And where the right is unable first to win electorally, they win through the manipulation of institutions, such as here in Brazil in 2016, followed by electoral processes, or a more traditional military coup in Honduras in 2009, or the Paraguayan manipulation of 2012 to get rid of Lugo, and so on. But whether it is electorally through Macri or Piñera in Chile, or the congressional elections in Venezuela, or whether it's through extra-institutional politics elsewhere in Latin America, the new right gains tremendous momentum. And the only real anomaly to this dynamic continues to be Mexico, which has been out of pace, out of step with this dynamic from the beginning. As South America was moving to the left over the course of the early 2000s, there was no such movement in Mexican domestic politics. And just as South America moves fundamentally to a restoration of the right, Mexico enters into a contradictory left populist dynamic of its own with the rise of AMLO in the recent elections there. So we can talk about all of these dynamics, but I've reached my 40 minutes.
Okay. Bom, então abrimos para as questões. Bom, eu tenho uma. I have a question. Bom, first, thanks, Jeff, for your presentation. Very interesting. I would like to ask you about the relationship between the dominant classes and the emergence of the new rights, right-wing alternatives in Latin America. The question is, why do you think this rise carries a new right-wing movement? Because why don't the dominant classes connect themselves to the traditional right-wing parties? Of course, there is an answer presupposed in this question, that is, it's not only a question of dominant classes relating to right-wing parties, but also the fact that they're competing for an electoral basis. So it's a popular competition there. And so it's a democratic competition there somehow. So I would like you to develop a little bit about it. In Brazil, for example, they could have gone for PSDB or other Democratas or other political parties and candidates that were available and also with a lot of resources in the last electoral campaign, considering, for example, Geraldo Alckmin, which was the Social Democrat Brazilian party here in Brazil, which managed to have a lot of resource for the electoral campaign and was one of the worst results in the election. In PSL, which is the party of Jair Bolsonaro, was basically an unknown party in terms of this traditional relationship with the dominant classes. So what does this populist moment could represent for not only for the right-wing movements, but also for the left-wing movement, but also for the right-wing movements? And the other question is about that is correlated to the first one, is why do you think that the left, center left and left-wing parties became incapable of an ideological appeal? What do you think is in the basis of it? That's it. Thanks.
Okay. So in the first question, I think it's interesting because in the 2000s, Latin America seemed out of step with the general trajectory of world politics insofar as there seemed to be, however deep, an alternative project being proposed to neoliberalism, which was really found no other echo in the world in that moment. I think what we're seeing now is Latin America re-entering into a tight parallel association with what's happening in much of the rest of the world. And the uniting dynamic of this has been the crisis of global capitalism in 2008, which obviously has particular rhythms in different places, but is the uniting feature which has been responsible for the decomposition of center-right and center-left parties virtually everywhere. And so the dominant dynamics in world politics at the moment are one of either social polarization, in which the center collapses, you have a far-right insurgent, and you have some kind of left to counter it, usually weaker, but a far-left growing of some sort. In Latin America, unfortunately, you have it's not social polarization, the resurgence of a far right of different sorts, typically not related to traditional parties, but with no answer from the left, primarily because, and this speaks to your second question, the disarticulation of the social basis of the left through the processes of passive revolution and the compensatory state under left-wing governments. So what I mean by that is, on the one hand, right-wing parties, the traditional right-wing parties in most of Latin America, clearly there are exceptions, but in most of Latin America, had already experienced fundamental decomposition in the early parts of this century. So between 1998 and 2000, you see an extraordinary collapse of neoliberal party systems throughout most of Latin America. And they never really recover in most places. There are exceptions, such as Chile, Sebastián Piñera, and so on. But in general, this is a dynamic that is happening. And on the left, one of the dynamics of passive revolution of compensatory states and progressive governments in this period was fundamentally a commitment to securing a passive consensus among their bases through incorporation into state institutions, rather than facilitating the continued growth of independent capacities of class struggle, regardless of which government was in power. So what does this mean on the ground? It means, for example, creating parallel labor federations or peasant federations in the case of Bolivia, which are state-aligned on the model of the Mexican Revolution, in which social mobilization is permitted, but only when it is conducted and in favor of the government against instrumental mobilization against the right. And so fundamentally, you see a process of incorporation, declining capacities of independent working class and peasant capacities for action, which is unable to recover even as they lose faith in the governments that they were committed to. So as these governments recede in popularity, and the ideological appeal was relatively straightforward. In my view, it was their commitment to, when faced with a sharp class question that couldn't be avoided, they needed to make one. You either shifted towards a radicalization of the process in an unfavorable climate, or you attempted to shift the the cost of austerity onto your traditional social bases. And the political wager consistently was that we can't lose credibility in the eyes of capital, and consistently they went that direction and paid the cost both by losing capital, who never saw them as credible, or at least as credible as returning of the right, and they lost their traditional social bases. But in a situation like Bolsonaro, for example, it's clear, as everyone will know in this room more than I will, but just to state the obvious point, that Bolsonaro wasn't the candidate of capital either, in the sense that it's not as though capital is directing this process. Capital only coheres around figures like Trump and Bolsonaro when all of their traditional representatives are unable to contest the political arena. In the last instance, they do align, and they all flood to these representatives, and for obvious reasons against the left. I don't really have anything original to say on that point. Just in that observation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ben.
What do you make of what happened in Mexico? Mexico is probably the second most important country in Latin America in terms of being the second most populous and the second biggest economy. It also has now a center-left government when it's really not had one probably since the 1930s. A leftist government. And secondly, on the Mexico point, while I think many people just said it's collapsed into the party system, and there's not really any radical difference of the López Obrador project to other center-left governments in Latin America. I think something which is particularly important for people in Brazil to pay notice to, unfortunately I don't think I've heard many people debating this, is that the Mexican left, whatever you make of their actual policies, won the debate on security and crime in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And in a country which has faced probably 250,000 people dead over a drug war in the last 15 years or so, this is not an insignificant thing. And the drug war has been as much a war against the left, indigenous people, and civil society. So what do we make of this development of the left finally winning a debate on security in Latin America?
Você se inscreveu? É que eu vi que você fez assim. Se você falar em inglês, é direto para eles. Se você falar em português, eu tenho que traduzir.
Should I try this?
Mais alguém quer a gente coletar umas 3 intervenções? Okay. Ah.
So, thank you very much for the talk. I just would like to know a little bit more about how would you connect the first theoretical sources, like in terms of Mariapego, with your diagnosis with your current diagnosis and a path for political action in the future in this theoretical framework.
Okay. So on Ben's very apt question about the anomaly of AMLO's success and security and crime, you could add to that corruption as a winning ticket, an unusual winning ticket for the left. I think there's something unique to Mexico in the sense of, although not very unique from seeing this from Brazil, but seeing this from the rest of Latin America, the level of violence are unusual. at least compared to, I mean, Central America, Brazil are also contending, but Mexico has an extraordinary dynamic in this regard, which makes it a pivotal feature of politics in a way that is not true of everywhere. It's not true of many Latin American countries. I think you have a paradox of AMLO in the sense that characteristically I'm deeply pessimistic of the possibilities of what he will be able to do, not just because of my general inclinations, but because of the idea that I think the social left in Mexico is extremely weak, fragmented, debilitated from the levels of violence. And so you have an electoral expression which is mostly based on not entirely, but mostly based on a certain degree of moralism, which is, so for example, the reduction of costs of bureaucrats within the dominant ministries is a specific way of avoiding any confrontation with capital. I mean, this generates no revenue for the state. It's merely, I mean, it's an indication that we're good, honest people doing a good, honest job. And I think this will have little resonance in the very short term. On security, the stakes are very high now that he's won, that he will be able to do anything about it in terms of the capacity to redirect this from a central kind of militarized campaign, which has been the state policy since 2006, to something else. Again, it seems to me that thus far the results aren't promising So although it was unique to have won on that ticket with a very clear, disastrous militarization policy of drugs, of the drug war under Calderón and Peña Nieto, I think the enduring characteristic of AMLO's presidency on this question is unlikely to be successful. But I mean, obviously, I hope that I'm wrong. But I don't have a lot of, and so what I'm saying is it won't give many lessons elsewhere, unless there's an actual capacity to reduce levels of violence. On the question of U.S. foreign policy, one of the ideas that I tried to emphasize in the book, in the Bush and Obama period that you were asking about, is to try to think about U.S. imperialism in more dynamic terms than is often done. So it's often seen as this unchanging behemoth to the north that has this overweening capacity to dictate what happens domestically. And I think what's interesting about the early 21st period was the relative weakness of U.S. imperialism to determine dynamics in Latin America. And you can see this in different ways. For one, the way that the commodities boom was driven by China and not by the United States meant that there was a new source of dynamism, which also created a new source of lines of credit, and also a reduction in the need of credit through the accumulation of massive foreign reserves abroad. And so what this meant in a very practical sense for U.S. imperialism is that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund disappeared from Latin America. I mean, in the 1990s, they had the capacity to determine who was going to be finance minister, more or less, through regular annual meetings and so on. They lost all capacity to do this in that period. This is now returning, but there was a relative autonomy. Again, this is only true of most of South America, and really not true ever of Central America and Mexico in that period, or the Caribbean. otherwise, there's no difference between Bush and Obama in terms of general orientation. They continue to attempt. I mean, Venezuela becomes the key sort of bogeyman of the period in different ways, but there was never any real intent on intervention, military intervention of the kind. It was traditional forms of financing domestic oppositions, attempting to destabilize governments and so on. But elsewhere, there were very good relations with, with a variety of left governments. Brazil effectively replaced or facilitated the occupation of Haiti in alliance with the U.S. Bolivia, in its very minor capacity, also sent troops. But Brazil was obviously a key player there, which isn't to say that Brazil, as the dominant sub-imperial power in South America, didn't have conflict with American interests. But it was also it was a matter of cooperation and conflict, not one of mere confrontation. The dynamic now is clearly novel in different ways. Less because of the unpredictability of Trump, and more about the new context of capitalist crisis. And what I mean by that is, obviously, Trump's stated positions fluctuate wildly. They promise massive deviation through, walls, military intervention, and so on. But thus far, you don't actually see extraordinary deviations from traditional U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. The context has changed, however, because allies on the right are now available, and so they're using those to hone in on particularly hot geopolitical spots. So the obvious example being Guaido's self-declaration as the interim president in Venezuela and so on, and the immediate within the same hour by Trump's administration, but also by Canada and by a whole series of Latin American governments, which are now further to the right than the European Union, which took at least 2 weeks to after wavering, to eventually accept Guaido as the new interim president. So there I see again more continuity than change, but in a new situation. And in the new situation, it's also more dangerous for Latin America because the United States are no longer overextended militarily in the Middle East, fighting at least 3 wars, which they were during the high point of the left turn. In terms of Thompson and Mariátegui and political strategy, I think without offering a fully articulated political strategy that gets us out of the situation we're in, I think it's more about who you look to as agency of transformation. So when it became clear that progressive governments of different varieties were committed more or less to a project of capitalist modernization with redistribution and so on, the priority ought to have been on the reclamation of an independence of class politics, an independence of capacities to mobilize for the interests of workers and peasants and indigenous peoples and so on. Meaning, this does not mean that you don't mobilize in defense of a center-left government against the far right, but it does mean that you don't disband the independence of your trade union by absorbing it into the parties of the party in government because it appears to be a friendly government. So a class independence. This isn't unique to E.P. Thompson and Mariátegui, but Mariátegui was fundamentally, I think Mariátegui was a heretic in all the ways that we need to be heretics right now. He was condemned by the Comintern for his romantic populist commitment, as they saw it, to indigenous liberation. He was condemned by Aprista populists in Peru for Eurocentric allegiance to supposed Western Marxism and the universal project of emancipation. And I think it would be appropriate to piss off the same set of people today. The people posing as Marxists in positions of state power, such as Álvaro García Linera, with a conception of capitalist modernization, because if that becomes what is known as Marxism, when that project collapses, as I think it will in Bolivia, as it has elsewhere, and the new right gains insurgency, if that is the association that the population has with Marxism, the renewal of Marxism is going to be a very long project, not one of electoral cycles, but one of generations. And so it's very important to recover an independent Marxist tradition. It doesn't have to be Thompson and Mariátegui. These are preferred preferences of mine. But it does have to be a sense in which Marxism should not be associated with a belief in the necessity of totally ecologically unsustainable capitalist industrial development for 100 years for the remote possibility of a classless communist society in the future, which is supposed to just emerge out of the... I mean, if that's not fantastical faith, I don't know what... I mean, romantic Marxism seems to me much more materialist in that basic sense.
Ok. Alguém tem mais uma questão? Uma última... Ok, Ben. Última rodada.
I'll respond very quickly to, I think there's something interesting I was thinking about in Mexico. Three quick points. One is Mexico, it's very early still, but AMLO has a rate of approval of 87%, which is higher than even Lula at the peak of the meeting in like 2009. And I think this isn't just due to being different. I think there's two things going on. The first is the category for success for this government, in terms of what you point, in terms of the social left, is in a country where essentially it's impossible to be politically active without being killed in 70% of the country, basically, or being kidnapped or tortured, is to make possible the conditions for a social left to operate, regardless of what minimum reforms it requires for the majority of the country. And this is something I think resonates in Brazil if things like militias expand, and Bolsonarism, if it means an expansion of private violence or state violence in this case. The third thing is, I think the interesting version of this campaign, the specific thing that he's actually done, is this campaign against oil theft, which has been a billion-dollar industry in Mexico, and effectively was allowed to thrive, and is the second largest criminal contributor to the funds after drugs in Mexico, because under Peña Nieto, the state wanted to privatize Pemex, a state oil company, so they let people tap into state lines with impunity and said this is basically why we need to privatize things. Now, he does this, and immediately there's oil shortages, and people are like, this is the end of the government. This is like the classic, people queuing for gasoline is a sign of crisis. And people remember the truck drivers strike here last year. But this was incredibly popular. It not only restores money to the state, but also effectively ends the campaign to privatize Pemex. So that's just an example of, I think, something on security there's something to learn from. It's not just, like law and order districts, it's something else going on.
If you may answer to Ben and also make your final consideration.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, I agree with you. I don't have so much to add, except that I guess maybe it's I mean, you didn't say it explicitly, but maybe the degree of hope and the metric of success are maybe what we might not agree on exactly. Although on the metric of success, clearly, yes. What the hope is, and the reason for the popularity is providing a space in which you can operate on the left. This is what the left hopes for. But what the general populace hopes for is, to operate in any sense of a meaningful life outside of extreme levels of violence. AMLO, in my view, doesn't have a particularly strong record of providing conditions for independent capacity of left to operate. Comparative to the governments that came before, very obviously, yes. But he's not one rooted in a tradition of independent mobilization or even remote support for these kinds of activities in his period as mayor and in his historical trajectory, except when mobilization is about his electoral campaigns. I think there's reasons to be very suspicious of that for very recent histories elsewhere in Latin America. I think you're right that the oil dynamic was very good politics on the case, on the perspective of AMLO. I don't think it represents such a source of state revenue in a sense that will be in some kind of transformative sense for the Mexican state. So, I mean, I think that's I think the real game there is a political one rather than a solution for, or even a modest solution for, of recovering capitalist dynamism in Mexico, which is very bleak because of the integration with the United States, which has no capacity to recover. So I think, but likewise, that same negative external environment faces all of the new rights. I mean, this is I rarely end on a hopeful note. I'll end on this hopeful, or at least ambiguous note, in that the new rights that are coming to office have no exit to the crisis which persists, and with all credible economists, not just Marxist economists, but credible Keynesian economists predicting a very extended period of secular stagnation in the world economy, there's going to be no external environment producing an easy condition for recovery. So I think what you'll find is that those in office everywhere are going to be unpopular, even AMLO, from 87%. But at least it's a high place to fall down from.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Jeff, for your seminar. That's
Thanks.
it. É isso, gente. Obrigada, Jeff. Bolsonaro is falling very quickly. He's already almost, is it 30%? Yeah, he's falling,
Yeah.
which is very good.
Yes. Things to be happy about.
And tomorrow, are you fluent in Spanish? I think you will be doing in Spanish there.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I have to rely on notes more, but
Yeah,
But-
when you're speaking Spanish.
yeah.
And you were just in time. 40 minutes.
It wasn't biological though.
It wasn't biological. I expected more from you. I expected more. Disappointed.
Yes.